holds the future. And so I'm not, first of all, I'm a quantum physicist, so I never see the world in singularities. But there's no particles in the world. There's no individual particles named T. There's a flux of potential. And it just so happens that the current context creates a particular potential for the kind of people we are getting. And they're clones of your kind of person everywhere in the world. And that's something I think it's very important to remember if you're in America. That they're getting created everywhere. Because the context needs them. Now, I've been involved now for nearly 5 decades in ecological work, protecting the earth. And it used to be the case in the 70s all the way up to the 90s that our environmental work was done primarily locally, at best nationally. Because economic decisions were made nationally. And so all the harm that could happen was within the country. And that is the reason in 1992 we were able to get together as an international community of environmental movements to basically get governments to get together to sign the treaties at the Earth Summit. The Climate Treaty, the Biodiversity Treaty, the Rio Principles. That was 92. And I remember we were saying, it's all very fragmented. You've got a UNEP, a United Nations Environment Program, sitting in Nairobi. You've got a Montreal Protocol sitting in Montreal, a Convention on Biological Diversity sitting here, a Climate Treaty sitting in Bonn. And surely the planet needs more coherent governance, and we should have an international environmental agency, a full agency under the United Nations. And the argument being used by all the powerful countries was, no, we've passed the time to create new international bodies. 3 years later, we got a new international body. It's called the World Trade Organization. Now, in those days, we got together and created an international forum on globalization. We stopped WTO in Seattle. We stopped WTO in Cancun. We as good as stopped it in Hong Kong. And as Pascal Lamy, the Director General of WTO for a long time, used to say, WTO is in intensive care. Why did I get involved in saving seeds and building the movement called Nathania? Because the corporations got together and said, it's not enough to have national markets. We need global markets. And it was the case that, it isn't that we haven't had international trade before. We've had international trade. In fact, before colonialism was born, India was the center of international trade. India accounted for 25% of the world economy before the British came to India. And it was that wealth that Columbus was seeking, which is why he set out and landed in the wrong place. But his non-discovery of India became the discovery of America. And the very fact that all the Native Americans are called Indians is because of that blunder. And he was coming to India, actually. But of course, because they were coming to get the wealth, then they got the gold, they got the rest, they got the territories. I don't have to tell you the history of this continent, you know it well enough. I hope you do. But India's colonization was based on 3 very, very important issues that shape our lives everywhere. The first is the birth of a corporation. We had businesses before that. We had people doing trade. First time a corporation was created called the East India Company, chartered by Queen Elizabeth. 300 merchant adventurers of London. That's what they used to be called, merchant adventurers. Take a ship, set sail, grab what they can. And the reason a corporation was created was because, if you notice, the term used is limited liability corporation. Why is that term limited liability used? Because if I do something as an individual, if I lose, it's my loss. If I gain, it's my gain. With a separation between the individuals and the creation of a corporate form, if I lose, the loss is society. Society pays for my losses. If I win, it's all mine. So it was the socialization of costs and the privatization of benefits. And the socialization of costs because, you know, the British was looting, the Spaniards were looting, the French were looting, the Dutch were looting, fighting each other. And this was their insurance in a way, that even if they lose, the individuals will never lose. It'll always be society bailing them out, just like the banks were bailed out in 2008 in this country by ordinary people. Tax money. So the creation of the corporation is related to the fact that India is a big trading nation with the best spices, the best textile, was really the hub of international trade. You don't have to guess too much why the East India Company was called India. You know, it wasn't called another country. The second thing that was created along with the East India Company was free trade. East India Company was created in 1600. 1716, they arrived and bribed the courts of a declining Mughal empire. 500 rupees, which is like $10, to get a free trade agreement between the Right Honourable East India Company and Farrukh Shir, who was the so-called emperor at that time. And just like the trade treaties of today, the trade treaties of then were no taxes, but taxes on local businesses, armed protection, and all kinds of concessions. So a trading company ended up ruling us in a little while with wars and the famous Battle of Plassey. And that time Clive was the richest man, the one who headed East India Company in India. Won't go into those details because that's boring Indian history for you, or British history, or the history of the empire. But the third very important aspect was the fact that war and militarism became the basis of economy with all of this. And in fact, there's a very, very good book on the whole history of cotton. It says the system shouldn't be called capitalism, it should be called war capitalism. Because for 200 years, money was only made through wars and violence. It's only after that you grabbed the land, you could capture the Africans, you could send them to pick cotton in the cotton fields, you could take over India. When all of that was put in place, control over resources and markets, then the factories could deliver. You could have done all of the Manchester mills, but if you hadn't controlled the cotton of the world and then the indigo of the world and the slaves of the world, they'd have been dead machines. Nothing would have been created. And those prior years of violence, as well as the control over resources, the control over people's labor through slavery, that is what created the system, though of course narratives were written about the brilliance of technology. Yeah? That it was innovation that made Britain the empire it was. So when the WTO gets established, it's in a way bringing back that system. We had a freedom movement to get rid of that system. You had an independence movement to get rid of that system. You even had your robber barons And all of the history of the United States post-1930 is a history of not letting robber barons rule. In a way, what we've seen happen today is a return to the age of the robber barons and the age of Clive. And that's why one shouldn't look at only individuals. One should look at an individual saying, how come? But look at the patterns and the structures that allow this kind of phenomena to happen, so that we engage in changing those structures, including the structures of mind. So in 1987, I was invited to a meeting where I was, in a way, by default, briefed about the world that was being shaped, about intellectual property rights in free trade agreements. And I remember the corporation saying, it is not fair that farmers save seeds, which meant it would be fair to prevent them from saving seeds through patent laws and intellectual property laws. But the very idea of seed as intellectual property, as patentable material, a patent is granted for an invention. Machines can be invented. New chemical molecules can be invented. Life as an evolutionary process with billions of years of history in nature, 10,000 years of work of farmers in breeding. One trivial change in that seed is not an invention. It's scientifically inaccurate, and therefore the legal appropriation of the seed through patenting, for me, is very wrong. And having heard this, I said, this is nonsense. And I often explain, and interestingly, the chemical industry which came from the war, again, most people don't remember that every aspect of industrial farming is rooted in the war. Machinery, the synthetic fertilizers, the factories that made explosives and bombs by burning fossil fuels at very high temperature and fixing nitrogen, are the same. The method of making explosives, the method of making fertilizer, which is why fertilizers can become bombs so easily. Whether it's Oklahoma or Oslo or Hyderabad or Delhi, fertilizer bomb, Afghanistan, every bomb in Afghanistan is a fertilizer bomb. Given, the fertilizer was given by the US to fight the Soviets. Today it's being used to defeat the forces that are there. The early pesticides were not designed to kill pests, they were designed to kill people. They weren't called pesticides. It was Xylon B used in the concentration camps. It was poison gases used in the fields against the French. They were designed to kill, that was their objective. So when in 1984 there's a leak of the pesticide plant in Bhopal, owned by Union Carbide, then owned by Dow now. Dow and DuPont have since then merged. I say it wasn't an accident, because these are chemicals designed to kill people. And after the wars, when these companies should have wrapped up, they just redesigned their chemicals and said you can't do agriculture without these poisons. And can you imagine, here we are, every curriculum in agriculture is written on that lie that without chemicals you can't grow food. That you increase food production with synthetic fertilizers, even though you're killing the soil, you're killing other species, you're actually destroying the biodiversity that is food. But along with the fact that the chemicals came from war, the power of these corporations came from war. And just like today, during the war, the corporations on two sides of the war had partnerships to sell the same chemicals. So Monsanto and Bayer, which are merging again, Bayer was part of IG Farben, which was tried at Nuremberg, and Monsanto was an American company. But they had a common company called Mobay to sell the same chemicals on all sides. The herbicides, like Agent Orange, used in the Vietnam War. Then you turn around and say, absolutely necessary to have Roundup to keep lawns clean. And then you go the next step and evolve seeds to be resistant to the Roundup. So you continue to sell the chemicals. You now have a seed you can patent because you said that adding a new gene of herbicide resistant means inventing a new seed. For people who get very, intellectual property is not an easy subject. It's so distorted. It's extremely distorted to create an alternative worldview on alternative facts. Yeah? So I always say, you want to understand what the whole thing is? It's basically GMOs saying, God move over. Monsanto saying basically, creation, nature, God, whatever you believe in, you don't exist. We will now go around as the creators, collect rents from nature and nature's capacity to reproduce, and from farmers and the farmers' capacity to breed seed. Together, this is where they were looking for their future money. And Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, and there's a very, very strong paragraph there about industry that had made big money out of war, continued to sell these chemicals, pesticides. So Albert Howard wrote The Agricultural Testament. He's written the same in his book. So people who were pointing out these chemicals came from the war. It was an addiction to profits that led to their continuity. And it's their addiction to profits that led to their creating totally new fictions, like intellectual property rights and seed. So the WTO has three aspects that trade agreements before that did not. One is this intellectual property issue. The second is trade in agriculture. Because of the wars, countries had become food insecure. So nobody wanted trade in food. Everyone wanted food sovereignty. Yeah, everyone wanted their agriculture policy to be based on making sure it didn't run out. And the third is a whole new term, another very complicated term, which is totally meaningless to ordinary people, called sanitary and phytosanitary agreement. Basically, I call it the pseudo-safety laws. So Monsanto literally wrote the intellectual property laws of WTO. Its representative, James Enyart, is on record saying in 95, after the whole treaty came into force, we achieved something unprecedented. We wrote an agreement, took it to our government, which then forced it on the rest of the world. Monsanto says we wrote the intellectual property agreement, and then they go on to say we were the patient, the diagnostician, and the physician all in one. We defined a problem, and for them the problem was farmers save seeds. And then they offered a solution, and the solution was now it should be illegal to save seeds. The trade agreement in agriculture is literally written by Cargill, the world's biggest grain trader. And the sanitary and phytosanitary agreements were written by the Nestle's and the Pepsi's and the Coca-Colas of the world. So they were basically looking at pushing GMOs everywhere, having no borders, and pushing junk food on all people. And this goes hand in hand with three aspects of globalization, which are so important to remember. The first aspect is privatization. It was the privatization of the seed that guided all the work that I do, because I do deeply believe that life in its diversity and seed as the source of life in its renewal is self-organized, it reproduces, it is not an invention, it is not a machine, It is nobody's property, it is the commons. And so I took a pledge to myself. We will not believe in these illusions. We will not obey. We will continue to save seeds, because our higher duty to the earth and our higher duty to our society and the future generations is to save seeds. So our members take a pledge. We've received these seeds from nature and our ancestors. We owe it to the future generations to pass them on in the diversity, integrity, beauty in which we receive them. And therefore it is our duty to not obey a law that comes in the way of our higher duty. So we will never recognize that. We will never recognize that. Of course, there's other aspects of privatization. I look at your list of people in cabinet, and Bill Moyers has called it the United States of ALEC. Yeah, not the United States of America. ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's basically the group that worked over decades. And everyone who's a cabinet member has been a member of this group. So you've got a lady heading education who believes in privatization of education, a lady heading transport who believes in privatization of transport, a lady heading health who believes in privatization of health. You've got an EPA representative who believes it shouldn't exist. You've got a Secretary of State who's Exxon. And that's why I say, when you look at the process, I think it's important to not give Trump too much importance, because he hasn't picked this cabinet. This cabinet has been picked by the billionaires. And I want to share a little with you how the billionaires became the billionaires so easily and so quickly. The second aspect, besides, and privatization, because it goes hand in hand with the issues of patenting. There's such a mad rush of patenting. It's absolutely crazy. But what do patents create? They create a rental economy. Just like when they're landlords, the landlord doesn't have to work, the peasant works in the field, but the landlord makes the money. When houses don't belong to people, those who own the houses collect the rents. Monsanto tried to create a rental economy on seed. I think we've been very successful in not letting them get where they wanted. They had stated that by the year 2000, every seed will be genetically modified and patented. Only 4 crops in 7 countries with 2 traits: corn, canola, soya, cotton. That's it. The rest is all GMO free and patent free. And movements for seed saving are just bursting everywhere. Just like movements of ecological agriculture are bursting, and movements for local food systems are bursting everywhere. But at one level, even Apple is a rental economy. They make nothing. It's all made in China. But they have patents. Down to the level, forget what's inside it. They sued Samsung because of the curve of the phone. Can you imagine they own the curve? It's like Pepsi sued someone for the blue. And McDonald's sued someone for the M. So it's basically a system not based on creativity, but on monopoly. Based on false claim to creativity. I've had to fight so many cases where there's been patenting of knowledge we already have, the fact that neem can control pests. 11 years I fought that case. Jointly, a patent was taken by the US Department of Agriculture and W.R. Grace, which was responsible for the contamination of groundwater in Massachusetts. A film called Civil Action. You remember, Jean? Met the author of the book called A Civil Action. It's right next door to you.
Read it.
That company, with the US Department of Agriculture, tried to patent the neem 11 years before, and we won. And I remember in the patent office in Europe, because I'm brown and I'm a woman and I wear a sari, now how backward could that be? And they're sitting in this, the patent office, when we challenge a patent, it's like a court. And they're pointing like that at me and saying, she cannot be here. So the judge says, why not? He says, because she is not a European. I say, Your Honor, neither are they. Because they were Americans. But you know, there's this Anglo-Saxon unity of we own the world. In your country is on the serious rise of white supremacy. 11 years and we won. Patent on basmati, we won. Monsanto tried to take a patent on an ancient Indian wheat that does not contribute to gluten. I want to go to every restaurant that puts G where there's wheat. I said, why are you putting G where there's wheat? Oh, because of gluten. I said, but not all wheats contribute to gluten allergies. Ancient wheats don't. Diversity does not. Uniformity of wheat and industrial breeding is what has led to uniformity of molecules in the gluten, which lead to the allergy. It's a problem of a uniformity, not a problem of plant. But you know, we got into this habit of criminalizing innocence, from wheat to visitors. The second aspect of this globalization phenomena is deregulation. And deregulation has two facets to it. First is deregulate the criminals. If they are destroying the environment, get rid of environmental laws. If they're exploiting workers, get rid of workers' laws. In fact, the speech I was listening to today, one of the things that was said is, we can only create jobs in America if we get rid of regulations for workers. That the laws that protect the worker are now being defined as laws that are in the way of the worker. And we've got to get rid of taxes for the corporations so that they can create more jobs. But there's the other side to deregulation, which is excessive regulation of ordinary civic action. The issue of seed is so clear. So, Monsanto's GMOs are to be regulated. They shouldn't be assessed, even though there is an international law called the Biosafety Protocol, the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, and I was part of the team that wrote the framework for that treaty. This country doesn't implement it. It doesn't have a biosafety law. It doesn't have a law for assessing GMOs for their safety. And Senior President Bush walked out of the Earth side, saying, I will not allow an agreement that comes in the way of my biotechnology industry. Which is another, I think it's a helpful thing to see, that this deregulation doesn't begin today. It's been going on for a while. Now, one of the regulations that was so important to put an end to the age of the robber barons was the law that separated savings from speculation and investment. I think it was called the Glass-Steagall Act. That dismantling is what has led to all of the financial speculation. Now, what's the equivalent to preventing farmers from saving seeds? It's preventing safe food. I was in Los Angeles and a person I heard about but hadn't met before came to meet me. He founded a group called Food Not Bombs. A few years ago, they were distributing food to the homeless and they were arrested. Because under the new food safety modernization law, it's dangerous to share food. There were announcements to make biscuits and cakes for hospitals in England. They were stopped under this food safety modernization. 98, they started to dump GM soya in India and literally our indigenous edible oils were banned. We eat mustard in North India, coconut in Kerala, sesame, groundnut. We have the highest diversity of edible oils. And our local oils were banned. And I had to do a non-cooperation movement to bring edible oils back, 98. Last year, I was at Gandhi's ashram. Because Gandhi had, didn't just have good ideas, he actually implemented everything he thought about. So there's this place called Sevagram in the heart of India, where the way life should be, he basically created a whole community about weaving and spinning and artisanal production, including cold press of oil, the healthiest way you should have oil. I mean, solvent extraction uses hexane, which is a known neurotoxin. You don't need to do all that to your food when you can have good pure oil. Well, they actually tried to shut down Gandhi's cold press mill. And what are the rules in this modernization of safety? That's why I call them pseudo-safety. That Gandhi did not employ 2 scientists and he did not have a lab. So, artisanal processing of cheese. Some of the best cheese making in Italy has suffered because the European standards don't allow it to go through. And I remember seeing that, you know how these sanitary and phytosanitary rules are created. They have trays, and if you have safety for the apple, then there's a tray with a certain size of the apple, and it should just fit. If it goes through and is too small, can't sell it. If it's too big, can't sell it. If a cucumber doesn't go through this tray because it has an elegance to it, a bend, it has to be straight. A crooked cucumber is dangerous for your health. And you must have heard a lot of talk on the issue of food waste. 50% of the food in this country is wasted. 50%. And in any industrialized society, that's the rate. The large part of the waste begins with this Cartesian measure of uniformity. That if your cabbages aren't just this size, if your lettuce has this size, it's basically just thrown away. So half the field is destroyed. I was in New Zealand for the GMO fight, and there was so much fruit under the trees. I said, why are they wasting so much fruit? They said, it didn't pass the test. I said, what test? It wasn't the right size. They literally go around measuring the size. How does the size of food have anything to do with safety? The pesticides in it, the genetic engineering, that's what decides unsafe food, not the size. Now, I fought this very hard when India was changing law. At least we don't have size as a measure. But we still have to do a case to get rid of this thing that if you're doing artisanal production and you don't have a lab, you have to go out of the window. And the only kind of food that is worthy of being eaten is food processed without chemicals. Because if you don't process fresh and local and nearby, then the only way you can have food is with all kinds of additives. And they are untested. You've read The Fast Food Nation. 32 untested chemicals to cook up the flavor of strawberry, when all you need is strawberry to taste strawberry. All of food science today is really much more about psychiatric illusions that you are thinking of the state. When our gut, with trillions of bacteria, all the senses to taste real sense. And I always say, you can cheat on a label, you can cheat on a supermarket shelf, but you can't cheat the bacteria. And that's why all the sicknesses of today are so related to the fact that a cheating food industry, that's another phrase, your so-called leader. You call the judge a so-called judge, right? So we can say so-called. He said, the other countries are cheating. Well, the real cheating is going on with the fact that $400 billion is being spent to subsidize bad food produced at very high cost and ship it around the world. The second level at which cheating is happening is selling toxic food to citizens and not letting them know. The third is an EPA, which should be testing some of this out, stops doing its job. That's cheating. Fourth is when Vermont gets a labeling law, then you pass a dark act to prevent people from knowing whether their food has GMOs. That's cheating. And we need an honest food system. We need honest trade. We need honesty in everything we do, not judged by someone else, but an honesty and truth that we experience through our lives. 75% of the planetary destruction today is because of the bad food system, the industrial globalized food system. It's also responsible for 75% of all the health. They have the new term called non-communicable chronic diseases. They should just call them bad food diseases. They sometimes call them lifestyle diseases. My colleague Maya has named them food style diseases. They depend on the bad food that you eat. But it doesn't stop there. It goes on to uproot people. I mean, 75% of all uprooting is happening because of industry farming and dumping. In India, the dumping of pulses, the dumping of bad palm oil and bad GMO soya oil, subsidized. Did a calculation on soya, $190 subsidy in this country to make the soya $150 on the international market. And then we are bullied to subsidize it further, so it's cheaper than any local oil that's good. So that's another, the cheapness of bad food and industrial food is the highest level of cheating, because it's not telling the true price. We've done a book called Wealth Per Acre in which we did a true cost accounting. Chemical farming is costing India every year on social and environmental terms $1.2 trillion. And our environment minister has written the foreword because he realized how big the costs we are paying. It's called, we call this externality. It's not counted. But if you add the health damage of the cancers, the diabetes, the hypertensions, the cardiovascular diseases, you'd have to add another 2 trillion. So we are talking of, our GDP is around 1.2, which is anyway a false measure. But here's $4 trillion societies being made to pay, so that a small group of corporations can win. They're zeroing on food because it is the part of the economy that everyone must engage in. You know, how many of us are going to buy Boeing jets? Any of you? But all of us will have to eat food. And it's not for nothing that the biggest corporations are coming into it. Now, I was just looking at the figures. In 2010, which is only 6 years ago, the number of billionaires who controlled half the wealth of the world was 388. Last year it had jumped to 62. And we used to joke and say, 62 men in a bus, that bus should go off somewhere. You know what it is this year? 8. 8 billionaires. And I want to take you to take a step back. I talked about how the merchant adventurers of London created the East India Company. So East India Company was the front. It wasn't an entity in and of itself. It was the legal face. These people. And in a very similar way, it's this small group of super wealthy people who have become rich through privatization and collecting rents. They've become rich through deregulation. They've become rich through this international trade by forcing things on others. And when you turn the world into a market, it's a huge market. And that's why they're after India with 1.3 billion people. And that's a huge food market. So you have to destroy the fact that we produce our own food, and good food at that. So if you just look at the corporations that are playing a big role in the food system just now. It's the Pepsis and the Cokes and the General Mills and the ADMs and the Walmarts and the Crafts and the Hershey's and the Conagras and the McDonald's and the Campbell's and the Nestle's and the Danons and the Kellogg's and the DuPonts and the Syngentas and the Dows and the Bayers and the Monsanto. Now, as far as the agrichemical seed bit is concerned, there are now three. Dow has merged with DuPont, Monsanto with Bayer, Syngenta with ChemChina. But it's not just that there are three. The same three give you cancer because of the toxics in the food, and then they sell you the patented cancer drug. And so for them it's win, win, win. And I realized this was not, it wasn't just that they were collecting rents, but they have the perpetual motion money-making machine. And I realized this 84, I was traveling to Ethiopia. They had the big famine that year, and I was working for the United Nations, so I'm traveling and I've got a person sitting next to me who wants to know why am I going. I said to figure out the real causes of the famine, because by then I knew that there are ecological reasons these things happen. And I said, and you? He said, well, I work for Pioneer Hybrid, I'm going to sell hybrid seeds. I said, but they have a drought. Hybrid seeds will fail. He said, that's precisely it. The more it fails, the more we sell. Now that's the market. The more it fails, the more we sell. The more it creates more problems, the more we sell. So for everything that creates 10 problems, we have 10 more markets. So you get 50% greenhouse gases out of climate change. Who's wanting to make money out of climate change? Monsanto. Bought up the world's biggest climate data corporation, the world's biggest soil data corporation. It's now hooking up with Silicon Valley to create spyware and surveillance technologies to spy on farmers. For me, agriculture is such a beautiful act of becoming one with the earth. And this is where the whole world is waking up. And at this time where our relationship with the earth is our source of true freedom, all they can think of is how to spy. I said, come spy, see how much I love the earth, spy. See how beautifully our seeds grow and how well our soils do. Well, that's not the end of the story. Because when Bayer was merging with Monsanto, I said, but Bayer looks smaller than Monsanto to me, so how come they're buying Monsanto? My son, who's helping me a lot, writing my next book, which I call The Resurgence of the Real, because that's what we need in the rule of illusions. We do need to both know our real knowledge, know our real power, and build our real economies, create our real wealth. So doing this work, you realize that all the corporations are controlled by about 5 big giant investment funds. The big majority of shares are not in ordinary shareholders' pockets. It's the same Vanguard. Vanguard was a pathetic 25 billion 10 years ago. It is today more than $3.5 trillion of these rich men's money. These are bigger than Wall Street banks. They're just the private funds of the billionaires. And they bought up every one of those corporations I mentioned, the biggest shares are owned by these guys. So you really have, you can't even say 1% anymore, because how can 8 people be 1%? But let's use 1% as the metaphor that the Occupy movement created. That you really have them not just controlling every dimension of the economy, but because when that kind of concentration of power must happen, people will rise. Which is the reason politics has to become a subset of this 1% economy. And what you witness, what we witness, what Europe is witnessing is in effect the 1% running the electoral democracy process. And the 2 aspects of the electoral democracy process that kill democracy is, first, you basically buy the elections, which is why the ruling on Citizen United is so significant. When you treat the ability to buy an election as the freedom of speech of a corporation, and you bought, I mean, they're just trying to do it in India right now, pass new laws, create new mechanisms to hide where the money comes from, because we have a very strict election commission and it really monitors how much a candidate spends. But they have to remove this, the democracy in the representative electoral process, and make it a privatized appointment process. But the second, which is the more serious part, which we really, each of us has to individually be cautious about, is this system cannot work if people are united. So in 1857, Indians rose against the East India Company. In England, they talk about it as the Sepoy Mutiny. We talk about it as the First Freedom Movement. East India Company had to leave, got folded up, it disappeared, but then the British Crown took over. And the same structure stayed in place. And the first thing they put in place is, it's because the citizens were united, the Hindus and Muslims must be divided if they have to continue to rule and exploit it. So they instituted divide and rule as a policy. And I have very, very detailed sections of this in my forthcoming book. I have an older book called India Divided, which was written after 9/11, about how India was divided. It took more than a century to continue to construct false identities, to plant hate, to plant exclusion. And if there was anything in your election this year, or our elections, or in the European elections, it is when you have an economy of limitless greed and limitless unaccountability, it must, for its own survival, create a politics of hate and fear. Now, it is in our hands to not fall in that trap. It is in our hands to function in solidarity. And the two things I want to say in closing is this. You know, you have a huge debate going on about the whole Russian influence on the election. But the Russia of today is not the Soviet Union of yesterday. It too was dismembered. It too is being ruled by oligarchs. And at one level, what you see is a club of oligarchs talking to each other, pretending still we have to do wars, selling the Boeings to each other, but in effect, all they're doing is creating markets through mutual consent. And that's why you shouldn't be surprised that there isn't, the Cold War attitude still. Because the Cold War is over. Globalization has substituted it. Now there's an alliance of the oligarchs. And that is the reason part of the political mechanism is for the economically powerful to unite as one club. They talk to each other, they decide together, and yet go through this theater of we have to keep jobs in America. 100 jobs in an air conditioning unit. Maybe 5 jobs in Boeing. It wasn't shipping anything out, though they are. Modi has invited Boeing to come to India to make defense equipment. All this is much more to keep the public under fear and to make hate a voluntary expression. Because if you get people very, very agitated on this, and then there are some people who think the only people who are only legitimate migrants are the ones white in color, because everyone's a migrant here except the First Nations, then you get the divisions created very, very easily. And this the economics of the processes of the creation of the 1% have to go hand in hand with the xenophobic nationalism. And the xenophobic nationalism has nothing to do with the country. It has everything to do with a political environment of distraction. Keep them busy hating while we take over. Keep them busy being afraid while we rule. So what's the alternative? The alternative is to know that we have the capacity to act in solidarity. We have the capacity to live with compassion. We have the capacity to have not a globalized economy where resources get grabbed and junk gets sold, but local economies with a planetary consciousness. There is an option to globalized economies with xenophobic nationalism, and that is that our consciousness should really be that we are one Earth citizenry, united through the planet, through being born on this Earth, breathing this air, same air, eating the food she gives. If we think of ourselves as Earth beings, we realize we are all absolutely the same, because we are the children. And our expressions outside look different, but our life pulse is one pulse that comes from her. And as one planet and one humanity, we can and must create another life experience, not just another debate. You don't debate with non-debaters. The next change will not come by winning TV debates. The next change will come by living our full Earth citizenship, our full humanity in a very local way, but connected globally. That's what I call Earth democracy. The idea of colonization and new frontiers is something that, to me, is meaningless. What is called a new frontier for one person is just the home of another person. And because we are part of the Earth, there is nothing like colonization of nature and not harming humans. Some humans get harmed. Is that what you were asking? Or no? You were asking something else.
In the topic of it's being labeled as a colony, as what the hypothetical plans for farming on Mars is. That is being called a colony, however there aren't people there. So I was wondering what sort of your feelings you would say on that and the moral questions you might have.
For me, the moral question is about escape of responsibility. There's no escape. You've got to take responsibility. You can't ruin this planet and say, I will colonize Mars. Because you're performing two violations. One, violating your responsibility to this Earth, which is where we are born to live. And the second is assuming that Mars is waiting for you. Because there is nothing like an empty nature. That's another construct. The whole colonial enterprise was based on a construct of terra nullius, the empty land. And it was very well constructed. First Nations weren't fully human. The Australian Aboriginal people weren't fully human. So it was empty land waiting to be taken over. And I think we can't. It's just a wrong concept. And, Gandhi had a very beautiful statement, which was a distillation of some ancient Vedas, which basically says, the earth has enough for everyone's needs, but not for a few people's greed. Now, a mentality that says we can devastate the earth and move on to Mars necessarily means, and then we'll devastate Mars and look for the next. And the assumption of constantly destroying your home and other people's homes is the ethically irresponsible position.
Any
I think there's one more hand that side.
Vandana Shiva, in your time working at the UN in India, basically anywhere, throughout this entire talk, I've heard you speak of the interconnectedness of humanity and the earth and the necessity of unity. But at the same time, I hear this narrative of what the 0.1% is messing things up. And I hate to ask you to give us advice again, but what advice do you have for communicating ideas and bringing about social change within communities that really don't see things the same?
No advice. But I'll just tell you about myself. I thought English was a useless language. I did absolutely adore algebra and math and physics. Yeah. And my principal, my superior, called me to her office one day and said, "You're going to fail in life because I have to write my essays of English and algebra." And I said, if I can communicate it in this equation, why should I write 4 pages? Yeah. I was the head girl of my school. And I had to run assembly, and I absolutely refused because I hated to speak. And here I am speaking to you, writing books and books and books. Who really feeds the world? Oh, democracy. Seeing so many food security in its hands. How come I can get to speak and write? Because it's not about me. I think if you know you are one extended earth family, one extended human family, one local community, it's that communication of being one that is what allows communication to come as naturally as a spring. No one taught me public speaking.